The early followers of Jesus are convinced that he is the Messiah, even though what happened to him is not what was supposed to happen to the Messiah, just the opposite.
Oh, really? I wonder why Dr. Bart Ehrman would be saying this, especially when everything about Jesus is already a Jewish idea that was expected by some Jews. I wonder what on earth Bart thinks would be contradictory to Jewish expectations of the Messiah. Well, if you want to fuck around and find out what Dr. Bart Ehrman gets wrong this time, then please stay tuned. What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? I'm the Godless Engineer, and I critically analyze apologists' claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. I want to start off by encouraging everybody to go and watch Apologia's video because the premise of the video is really good. Also, Paul is awesome! It was a really bully thing for me to do, encouraging people to watch Paul's video. What I'm covering today is really a tangential statement made by Dr. Bart Ehrman, and it's something that he really didn't have to say, but he did anyways. In fact, Dr. Ehrman emphasizes a point that I've always tried to make. There's only a small subset of arguments that's strictly isolated to the mythicist hypothesis. Most of the hypothesis is actually supported by mainstream scholarship. Dr. Ehrman highlights a portion of this fact in Apologia's video.
If you just go on the internet and look for virgin births in antiquity, you'll find all sorts of sites, not all of them by mythicists, but by some mythicists are among them who say that Christians are just stealing this motif from the pagan world, that you have all these people who are born of virgins, Romulus, Hercules, and Alexander the Great, and whatever, they kind of give you the list of these people born of virgins. And so what I'm going to deal with in this seminar is that true? The seminar is not directed, it's not dealing with mythicists at all, but it's dealing with this widespread claim about supernatural births in antiquity. It's absolutely true that you have instances in the ancient world where people talk about a divine being who got a woman pregnant.
Well, obviously, the minimal mythicist hypothesis isn't claiming that Judaism is stealing from other cultures. The Jews that created the original Christian mystery cult were influenced by Hellenistic pagan ideas. So they weren't stealing, they were just affected by popular myths of the day. But at least Dr. Ehrman is stating that these aren't strictly mythicist ideas. These are ideas that exist in biblical studies in general. But let's get back to what Dr. Ehrman thinks Jesus did that is contradictory to the expectations of the first century Jews.
Even though what happened to him is not what was supposed to happen to the Messiah, just the opposite of what was supposed to happen to the Messiah. He got tortured to death by his enemies, which is just the opposite of what's happening. So what they have to do is they have to find places in Scripture that seem to show that someone like Jesus is a plausible Messiah. And so they start finding places, and some of them work better than others.
This was a very awkward thing for me to hear. Don't get me wrong, it's totally on par with what Dr. Ehrman thinks are facts about the historical Jesus. But it is a little confusing considering some information that's recently come to light. Dr. Jason Staples was a student of Dr. Bart Ehrman's when he was doing his dissertation. In Dr. Staples' dissertation, he has a footnote about a pre-Christian idea of a suffering and dying Messiah.
The oft-repeated dictum that there is no evidence for the concept of a suffering and dying anointed one, or of a messianic interpretation of the suffering servant in pre-Christian Judaism is therefore mistaken. Jason A. Staples, The Idea of Israel in Second Temple Judaism, page 180, Cambridge University Press.
As evidence of this fact, Dr. Staples cites William Brownlee's The Servant of the Lord in the Qumran Scrolls, number 1, Louis Ginsburg's The Oldest Interpretation of the Suffering Servant, John Goldingay's Commentary on Daniel, and Portier Young's Apocalypse Against Empire. Ehrman had to review this dissertation and had no problem with Staples having this in his footnote. Compounding on this section in Staples' dissertation, we have the Wisdom of Solomon and the Talmud. The Wisdom of Solomon is a first century Jewish text that the Christians heavily relied upon. In Wisdom 2:20, it says this about the Messiah.
Let us condemn him to a shameful death, for, according to what he says, he will be protected.
The entire section of the Wisdom of Solomon 2:12 to 3:3 attest to this pre-Christian idea of a suffering and dying Messiah. In the Talmud B, Sanhedrin 98b and 93b, it connects the suffering servant in Isaiah 52 and 53 to the Messiah. Then in B Sukkah 52a through b, the Talmud has a Christ ben Joseph that dies and then resurrects, even attaching it to an idea in Zechariah 12:10 that mentions piercing the firstborn son of God to death. Both the Talmud and the Wisdom of Solomon show that if Jews were really adverse to this idea of a disgraced and dying Messiah, then they wouldn't have separately developed the same ideas as Christians did without first explaining why Jesus didn't fulfill these expectations. So it's very obvious that these ideas were already constructed prior to the development of Christianity. So it seems to me that the more scholarly and more accurate description of the Jews in the first century would be that they had a very diverse landscape of ideas in Judaism. Some Jews did expect a triumphant Messiah figure to conquer Jerusalem for the Israelite people. Then there were also some Jews that were expecting a disgraced and dying Messiah. And some of those Jews ended up developing Christianity into a Hellenistic mystery cult, while the others continued in their sect of Judaism, waiting for their disgraced and dying Messiah, this Christ ben Joseph.
The virgin birth thing just doesn't work very well. Other passages don't work well either. I mean, the birth of Bethlehem is another one. So we're coming out of Egypt, etc. Yeah, I don't think the idea that they all knew what was really going on in the life of Jesus, and then they found these passages. I don't think that works. I think they're finding the passages in order to support their beliefs in Jesus.
All three of the items that he discussed have plausible explanations in the scriptures. Bethlehem is said to come from the scriptures. The virgin birth wasn't important until they started trying to convert pagans into Christianity. And the coming out of Egypt story is a mirror of Moses because the author of Matthew wanted to present Jesus as the new Moses. There is no evidence that solidly shows that these ideas about Jesus were historically true. If there even was a historical Jesus, there's also no evidence that shows that they post hoc rationalized scriptures to describe this historical Jesus. It's equally likely that all the supposed information stems from a scriptural understanding, and this historical Jesus just claimed these things about himself. Dr. Bart Ehrman doesn't agree that these ideas about the Messiah could have preceded any historical figure, but there's actually no evidence that should sway anybody one way or another in this particular discussion. Now, me personally, I find the arguments for scriptural interpretation being the source of this information to be vastly stronger than the historical arguments that suggest it was a post hoc rationalization for a historical figure. This, of course, is just a subjective determination based on the evidence. Well, heathens, that's going to be it for me today. I would love to hear your thoughts on Dr. Bart Ehrman and what he said here, especially in the context of what I've revealed about either his student's dissertation or the actual evidence that we have. Let me know down below in the comments. And while you're down there, why don't you hit up Paul's link first and go and check out his video, and then why don't you smash the like button here. And if you're interested in the topic of the historicity of Jesus, then why don't you subscribe so you can get more videos just like this. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens.